For the past few days, I've been playing AI Limit non-stop. It's the newest anime Souls-like game, and after about 30 hours playing, I'll be giving my impressions of the game and whether it's worth your time or not. Before we begin, I wanted to thank CE Asia for providing a free copy of the game for review purposes. It's a typical Souls-like story, and most Soulsborne fans will know what I mean with cryptic dialogue, barely any info from the cutscenes, and most of the story has to be pieced together by the player by reading the item descriptions and stuff. It's clear the story isn't really the big focus, as the main character herself, called Arissa, doesn't have any memories of her past and is just a vessel for the player to freely explore the game without worrying about the overall narrative. A basic rundown of the story is that humanity is facing extinction while a mud-like substance is encroaching all of the world, turning everything to necrotic monsters. The goal for the player is to find branches, which are essentially bonfires of this game, and uncover more information about herself as she explores this world. You do meet several NPCs with their own stories and side quests. Doing them is important, as some lead to alternate endings, and the true ending is locked behind specific side quest completion. I don't really want to spoil the story, even if it is paper thin, but I basically wanted to point out that it's not a story driven ARPG, with story elements sparsely sprinkled in as you beat bosses and uncover new characters. As with most Souls like games, this is something we've come to accept. The overall story itself is quite short in nature, as most of your playtime will be spent in combat and exploration, which I actually appreciated. Now, let's move on to the gameplay, which is what most people play these Souls-like games for. As mentioned earlier, combat is the most important aspect of this game, and it's pretty solid. The game shares many similarities with other games in the Souls-like genre, like a plethora of enemies to fight, a bunch of weapons to play around with, bosses to master, and so on. But there are some key differences here. First of all, the game doesn't feature a stamina meter, so you can essentially spam your attacks without ever worrying about running out of stamina. Now, this might sound like it would make the game easy, but to counter it, the devs have given most enemies hyper armor, meaning even if you spam your attacks, they will just tank through your second or third attack and clap you pretty hard. To me, I'm not really a huge fan of enemies tanking through your hits. I can understand if the weapon you're using is a small sword or something like that, but they can tank through even heavy weapons like scythes, lances, greatswords, etc. It leads to a situation where I ended up not using the slower weapons and slow casting spells at all, because enemies can either tank through them or interrupt your attacks easily. I just felt enemies have way too much priority compared to the player. Some late game enemies are super quick while your player moves and dodges really slowly, because it's all animation based. Not like in Souls where you dodge and it just rolls and it gives you a plenty of distance. In this game, not really. That's another thing to mention. There is no weight parameter in this game, so your dodge is always the same, start to finish. And it's not that quick, or does it really cover a great distance. Compared to the mid and late game enemies, your dodge is something that needed to be a bit quicker. Most of my deaths came from slow dodges or the dodge just not going far enough. Many enemies and bosses also have wide-screen sweeping attacks. 90% of the time, you're going to get clipped by these attacks, which just adds to the frustration. But it's not all bad, as you do get iframes in your dodges, and so perfect dodges can mitigate these issues. That is, if you're fighting the enemy one-on-one. Trying to dodge when multiple enemies attack you is pretty much a chore. And during the latter half of the game, that's something to watch out for, because there will be plenty of mobs throughout. Now, getting back to the stamina meter. While you don't have a conventional stamina meter, the game introduces a sync meter. This meter acts as both your guard meter as well as your energy meter used for weapon abilities and spells. The sync meter increases when you attack enemies, parry, or land riposte. But conversely, if you get hit, the sync meter starts going down. Once it reaches 0, your guard is broken and you are incapacitated for a second or two. In this state, you are very vulnerable to riposte from other enemies, usually ending with death. Using spells also drains the sync meter, and each spell has different sync meter requirements. Some can even use all 100% of your sync meter, so be mindful of your enemies and surroundings before you start spamming spells or weapon abilities. When it comes to the weapons, we got all sorts of swords, great swords, lances. halberds, sights, dual blades, etc. At first, each weapon had different unique abilities, but in mid to late game, the generic weapons started to recycle movesets and weapon abilities. Only the boss weapons truly had unique weapon abilities throughout. Spells, on the other hand, are pretty varied and can be obtained from specific NPC vendors, looted from exploring certain sections in the game, and can also be created from boss materials. Since boss materials are needed for weapons or spells, it will take a couple playthroughs to get all weapons and spells. Orisa, your character, also has access to tools that allow her to parry, block, augment her attack strength, and allows her to dodge faster. Using these tools does take up sync meter energy, so you can't really spam them as well. Both weapons and spells also have stat requirements such as strength, technique, spirit, etc. So leveling up Orisa by defeating enemies is something you want to do instead of just running past them and skipping them. You can respec all your parameters, but it does require you to reach a hidden zone to get a specific item called the Crystal Sprout in order to be able to respec. This area is not part of the main path, and so you can easily miss it. I would have preferred if the game allowed you to respec Orisa via the main story, but that's the design choice the devs went with, and we just have to live with it. Enemies are decently varied. You got monsters, necrotic beings, mutated blader hunters like Orisa, and many robotic enemies. I highly suggest getting projectiles to throw as well as some ranged spells, as there will be a plethora of ranged enemies who constantly spam projectiles and annoy you. One enemy later in the game was able to hit me even if it couldn't see me and was like 2 floors above me. Like 2 whole floors of concrete, in between, and could still see me and hit me with a complete AoE attack on the floor and was able to take me out. They really needed to balance the ranged enemies in this game because, in my opinion, that's the only drawback for the combat. Is like you're enjoying combat against all these various enemies. They're taking like a bunch of them on, and then there'll be like 4 ranged enemies on the top somewhere sniping you. And you can't even get to them. Some areas you can't actually get to them unless you go through the whole level and like teleport to the other side to kill these enemies while you're on the bridge on the other side, and these enemies are spamming you while you're fighting a boss, or not a mini boss, like a mini boss type enemy. It's outrageous at times. Bosses are unique and fun to fight throughout, but a few of them show up as regular enemies in later locations, which kind of ruins the unique feel for those few bosses. The world itself is pretty interconnected, has good level design and multiple routes to explore, but the overall experience is quite linear with some side areas to explore here and there. Either way, the main story always follows the same path every run. As mentioned before, multiple runs are required for all weapons, spells, and endings, so it would have been nice if they gave us a choice in how we tackled our main objectives, but just gotta follow a specific path, and that's what it is for the main story. Of course, you can choose when to do your side missions and all that, but I would have preferred a more open-ended situation for the main story where I could tackle different objectives, gather different weapons in a different order, rather than always getting the same stuff every run the same way. Overall, the gameplay is pretty solid and encourages a mix of aggressive and tactical strategies to overcome the enemies. More skilled players will easily breeze through enemies with an aggressive approach mixed in with some parries and attack buffs, whereas defensive players can use other tools to either block or dodge and retaliate when given the chance. There is a playstyle for everyone, and that is much appreciated and helps with changing things for new runs. Exploration is also quite fun, as there are plenty of armor, weapons, and spells to find, as well as plenty of mysteries related to the world and side quests for you to discover. In terms of performance, I played the game on PS5 Pro. There weren't any graphical options, but I did set my resolution to 4K, and I had VSync on for the majority of my time with the game. It ran really well, with few dips in FPS during sections that had a ton of projectiles and particle effects. I did, however, run into many glitches in the game, even with the latest Day 1 patch, according to the devs. Bugs like loot not dropping, or conversations not triggering, audio effects and voices randomly glitching out and, couldn't hear them. I even had one glitch where I was infinitely loading when teleporting from one location to another. All these issues were instantly remedied by closing the game and rebooting, but still, it wasn't just once or twice. These happened several times throughout my run, and during some critical moments, like I would be the first time I met an NPC called Vicus. He wasn't even speaking. I couldn't hear him speak. I missed an entire conversation. I thought I was just doing like maybe he's not voiced. So I had to reboot the game and came back to talk to him, and he was voiced. An entire dialogue just missed. I know it's like a small thing in the grand scheme of things, but like it happened during boss fights where I'm like close to winning a boss fight. Suddenly the sound is gone, and I'm like, that just ruins everything. Like a cutscene in between phases of a boss fight. I'm like, I have to restart the fight. It's just frustrating. The devs have been made aware of this and are working to have these sorted out for launch, but I am listing them in case they don't at launch so you know what to look out for. The game's visual aesthetics were great and character models all had nice details as well. Many of the bosses had unique designs and some of the clothing and armor sets looked awesome as well. Weapon designs, spell animations, and even combat animations were really good to look at as well. I really did enjoy them. Overall, a pretty game, and the anime aesthetics just adds to it. I do have to mention that sometimes when you're going through certain levels, the textures on the walls and like things that the game's not really focusing on can be a little lower quality and it will be noticeable. Audio design outside the audio bugs was decent, but voice acting for me was a mixed bag. Some NPCs sounded great, while others didn't. But to me, the main character, Arissa, was just cold and emotionless in her delivery. Maybe it's done on purpose because she has no memories, but still, every time she spoke, I audibly groaned. It was just not it in English. She needed to bring more emotion. It just felt like she was reading her lines while being bored to death. Lastly, in terms of replayability, the game does offer multiple New Game Plus runs, and you will need to do them in order to get the 3 different endings. Outside of that, enemies get buffed as well as new weapons and spells to unlock. My first run took around 18 hours and I was exploring a lot. I spent another 12 hours trying to unlock the other 2 endings. So there is quite a lot to do. Of course, if people aren't interested in the New Game Plus stuff, then the endings is all there is left to do. So it really depends on what players are seeking in Souls-like experiences. For me personally, I like making new builds, finding all the equipment, all the weapons, armor, endings, etc. The length is pretty decent for a Souls-like game. Overall, the game is pretty solid with some issues with the combat balancing when it comes to dodging, ranged enemies, and the entire latter half of the game being packed with enemy mobs. The game isn't really on par with Dark Souls or Elden Ring quality, but it is a solid ARPG in its own right. With plenty to explore, loot, and a lot of combat to look out for, I can recommend this game for Souls-like fans, new and old. I give this game an 8. I did really enjoy the game, even with some of the issues I had with the combat. I just personally had to change my own playstyle a bit to get accustomed to the way the game works, the game design, and the game mechanics. Of course, some design choices can be scrutinized, but overall the game delivers on the Souls-like experience most fans of the genre crave for and will be satisfied with. That's it for this one. Hope you guys enjoyed it. If you guys have any questions, feel free to comment below. I will try to reply to them if I can. Thanks for watching. See you guys next time. Take care.